It has been a very eventful week on the federal election campaign trail, and joining me now in studio to discuss it and dissect it all is Dr. Geoffrey Hale, political science professor at the University of Lethbridge. Welcome back to BCN.
Good to be with you this afternoon, Hal.
That's good. So Dr. Hale, let's start things off first of all talking about the Justin Trudeau blackface or brownface scandal. Has it really hurt the image and the brand of the Liberal Party that much?
Well, I think it may have hurt the brand, but fair-minded people realize that even immature 20-year-olds can grow up.
Or 29-year-olds.
Or 29-year-olds, 20-somethings.
Right.
And the real issue on the ballot is, for good or ill, do you trust this man to run the country today?
Well, and that actually lends itself back to the SNC-Lavalin scandal. I mean, there have been other issues as well, which may have tarnished the Liberal brand. And
I think for people who are paying attention, these are issues of concern. However, as Preston Manning used to say, it's not just are you the perfect candidate, but in the eyes of the people whose votes you need, are you better than the guy you're running against?
One of the platform policies that the Liberals are campaigning on right now is more gun control. You know, and of course, obviously in the bigger cities like Toronto, where there's a real issue, more so with gangs than so much with the guns, but here in rural Alberta, you know, when you talk gun control and taking rifles away from farmers and ranchers, that really doesn't fly.
Well, I think this is symbolic politics for people who don't think anybody needs a handgun, but your point is well taken. If the police have to drive 50 kilometers to get to your house to give you some protection in the middle of the night, having some kind of weapons to protect yourself, or if you're a farmer or a rancher, your animals from predators is part of what's necessary to protect your family. So we'll see what the Liberals come up with. The focus on assault weapons is probably more defensible than handguns, but we'll see how it plays out.
Now, the Liberals also announced they will not tax the first $15,000 of income, and the Tories want to lower the income tax bracket to 13.75%. They seem like very similar plans here. What are your thoughts?
They're relatively minor differences. I think there is a perception that there are a lot of people who are just getting by, living from paycheck to paycheck, so this will make a difference at the margin. If you're paying taxes already, the Tory proposal, well, if you're paying taxes already, both proposals will provide you with a small amount of help. If you're one of the third of Canadians who file tax returns that don't pay taxes yet, it's more symbolic politics than anything else.
Affordable housing seems to be a real issue as well. When a lot of the candidates are going to the doors and campaigning, they're knocking right now. Do any of the party platforms have a leg up on this one to get voters' attention?
Again, this is symbolic politics, but the reality is that both what the Conservatives and what the Liberals are proposing have the potential to increase demand without increasing the supply of housing. That will push up prices, and the regulatory changes that are needed to increase supply are generally within provincial jurisdiction, not federal jurisdiction. So they're trying to appear responsive, but a lot of the people who look at the numbers suggest that this may do as much harm than good.
And speaking of the numbers, according to the recent polls, it's really tight, especially in central Canada, Ontario and Quebec, between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And across Canada, could we potentially see a minority government?
It's possible that we could see a minority government. However, I think the media has done a massive disservice to the average thinking voter by looking at national horse race numbers. We don't have a national election. We have a whole bunch of regional, in many cases sub-regional elections, because the patterns of party competition vary hugely across the country. The 1 or 2 point spread in the polls reflects a 40-point spread in Alberta between the Conservatives and the Liberals. The Liberals are well ahead in Quebec, but those general numbers mask very significant differences in the sub-regional numbers in Quebec. There's a big difference between Montreal, where a yellow dog could get elected running as a Liberal, and suburban Quebec City, which leans more towards the Conservatives. And I think the big difference will be in the suburban areas of Montreal, which are traditionally nationalist. They're overwhelmingly French-speaking, and the Bloc Québécois could actually come up the middle there and take a number of seats.
How about in Ontario? A lot of seats in Ontario, a lot of big battlegrounds. Rural Ontario may go Conservative. Maybe the bigger centres, Ottawa, Toronto, Liberal. I mean, what are we looking at there?
Well, there was a poll in the papers today, even with small sampling, that showed the Conservatives running fourth in the city of Toronto, but being competitive in the GTA, the suburban belt around metropolitan Toronto. And so those races and who turns out and who stays home will make a tremendous difference.
What about the Atlantic provinces out in the Maritimes? Is that still strong Liberal territory?
I think the cities, by and large, are, although the Conservatives might be competitive in one of the St. John's, Newfoundland ridings. However, in New Brunswick, you have a provincial Conservative government that has recently been elected. A lot of the traditionally English-speaking ridings in New Brunswick, which have gone Conservative in the past, many of those people are running for election again, so they're known quantities. In Nova Scotia, the Conservatives are competitive in a number of seats where longtime Liberals like Scott Bryson have stepped down. And in Atlantic Canada, individual MPs, like lots of small town Canada, individual MPs, individual candidates make a lot more of a difference. So if a long-term incumbent has stepped down, a seat could be competitive where it wouldn't be otherwise.
How about Newfoundland and Labrador?
That one's harder to tell. The Conservatives in Newfoundland have not been close to the Conservatives federally since the days of Danny Williams, so it's hard to see where the Conservatives would pick up much support there.
Now, Dr. Hale, are the Tories a lock here in Western Canada? I mean, we can say yes for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, I'm assuming?
Well, again, you have Winnipeg, and you have the rest of the province.
Right.
If you looked at the results of the recent provincial election, downtown Winnipeg was NDP. The University District elected a couple of Liberals. The suburban areas voted fairly solidly Conservative, although there were some close races.
So Flin Flon, Brandon.
Flin Flon and Brandon
Thompson.
will be Liberal or NDP. Flin Flon and the North will be NDP.
Oh, wow.
Or possibly Liberal. The southwestern part of the province, including Brandon, will be solidly Conservative. So again, provincial numbers don't make up the whole story, where you've got a significant urban, suburban, rural divide.
Now, British Columbia is interesting. Tell me a bit about that.
The interior, again, will lead Conservative. The Fraser Valley probably as well. Where it gets interesting is where you get into Greater Vancouver. The Conservatives are competitive in suburban Vancouver ridings with large Chinese Canadian populations. They're not as competitive in areas with large South Asian populations. And you could see 3 or 4 party races in some of the suburban ridings going up the Fraser Valley.
Let me ask you a bit about Ontario again. Do you think the Doug Ford cuts, all the cut, really hurt the Conservative image in Ontario, even federally?
I don't know how much it was the cuts and how much it was Mr. Ford's ham-handed management style. People like people will accept sacrifice if they think it's being done competently and fairly. Doug Ford is an albatross on the Tory brand in Ontario.
If we see a Liberal minority government on October 21st, do you see maybe either the NDP or the Green Party propping up Justin Trudeau and the Liberals?
I think it's more likely that they will support the Liberals than the Conservatives. The question is how many bloc members will be elected, and how will that play into the results?
You know, what's interesting as well is there was a recent survey where talked about the amount of fundraising that was done. And apparently the Conservatives federally raised twice the amount of money as the Liberals. So if there was a minority government and another election, the government failed, another election was called, the Conservatives could afford another campaign where the Liberals could not.
Well, that may play a role, although the Conservatives' big challenge is to expand their pool of second choice votes. All the polling data that I've seen suggests that for the Liberals, the Greens, the NDs, they are one another's second choices. The Conservative second choice pool is limited to a relatively small proportion of the Liberal vote. And that polarization is something that Mr. Scheer and the Conservatives are going to have to figure out, because right now it's not working to their advantage.
What about the advertising? You know, a lot of the advertising from the Conservatives seems to be slamming and putting down Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. He's not as advertised. He was never ready. Is that negativity a negative on the voters as well?
I think where you have a competitive negative advertising rate, it has a tendency to depress turnout, because there are an awful lot of Canadians who are not strong partisans one way or the other. So the more negative your ads are, the more they may reinforce your core supporters. They may reinforce people who might be thinking of voting for the opposition, but this gives them a reason for a second thought. However, those people can just as equally stay home. Last time we had a big jump in support or in public turnout between 2011 and 2015, especially among young people. It's quite possible we could see a much lower turnout this time around.
You know, a lot of the constituents I've spoken to as well, they say, you know, I'd rather hear what you offer as a candidate as opposed to what the other guy's not offering. That's what they're saying about Scheer and Justin Trudeau. But it seems like even the Liberals are having some of that negative attack style ads right now.
Well, running against Andrew Scheer is a little bit like running against the Pillsbury Doughboy. So you have to connect him to other Conservatives who have a little more of an edge if you want to run negative ads. That's why the Liberals have been trying to tie Mr. Scheer to Doug Ford, who, as we've said, has a pretty poor public image in Ontario right now.
What about the Liberal health care plan compared to the Conservatives? What are the fundamental differences?
There's not a huge amount of detail in either one. The Liberals are talking national pharmacare, maybe, but it depends what we negotiate with the provinces. For the provinces, this is an old story. The federal government wants to buy change. The first question of the provinces is, this is a lot of money. We already have healthcare systems that are fairly stretched. How can we count on you to follow through on that promise over the long term? Because we've seen cases in the past where the feds have made promises and then have not delivered after an extended period of time. So the capacity of both levels of government to follow through on those commitments becomes critical. With the Conservatives, they're saying we will continue the path we've been on and that the previous government has been on for the last 15 years or so. We will promise you stable increases in funding. If people want you to spend more money on filling the gaps in drug benefits, then that's something to be worked out between provincial governments and their citizens. And there is something to be said about that. It's not flashy, it's not dramatic, it may be more sustainable.
Several parties have made major promises when it comes to climate change. It's a real hot button issue right now. Retrofitting buildings, doing less fracking, no fossil fuel power plants, no more pipelines. That doesn't sit well here in Alberta. Do you think that would actually resonate with some of the voters here?
There are the pragmatic, incremental things that can help people do a lot of little things that over time can make a difference. The splashier the promise, the more it involves taking people's jobs away, and that's harder to sell. It's the Green Plan to shut down the oil sands over a relatively short period of time reminds me of the Russian plan to redistribute the East German economy eastwards.
Right.
And so, given the fact that provinces own and control their resources, to say, for a federal party to say, we're going to shut down the biggest industry in a province is inviting a constitutional battle that is reminiscent of what Mr. Trudeau Mr. Trudeau Sr. walked into in the 1980s, and it just about tore the country apart.
You know, we're seeing some of the battles going on right now with Jason Kenney, our premier, vowing to fight C-48 and C-69 in court.
Well, that's what the courts are for.
Right.
And he may win or he may lose, depending on the quality of the arguments that he makes. Simply generating rhetoric won't do it. You have to show where in the Constitution, based on what precedents the federal government has overreached, and you have to do your homework. And if the province's lawyers have the capacity to do so, they may knock a hole in the federal government's case. On the tax issue per se, as opposed to the regulatory issue, it's going to be harder for them to do so.
JAGMEET SINGH, federal NDP leader. He's got a little bit of pizzazz. He's wonderful turbans, great colors, good-looking guy. He's actually younger than Trudeau. I think he's 40 years old, same age as Andrew Scheer. But do you think the federal NDP would actually be further ahead with Tom Mulcair still as the leader, as opposed to Jagmeet Singh?
Well, Mr. Singh's election has changed the landscape for the New Democrats in terms of their achievable voter support. And unfortunately, this speaks to some of the cultural divisions within Canada. I think there is fairly widespread acceptance in English Canada that we are a multicultural society, and the community that you're part of, the God you worship, should not be relevant to your running for public office. Some people are better at that on both the right and the left than others. However, in Quebec, they don't have a policy of integration of immigrants. Bring the best of your culture, be a fully participating member of society as somebody who is, for example, both Sikh and Canadian. They are much more into the old-fashioned melting pot style of assimilation en français. And so Mr. Singh is facing a very strong cultural gap. Mr. Mulcair was building on the success of Jack Layton, being the center-left party of choice in Quebec, and that was part of the reason the Liberals have shifted as far to the left as they have. With Mr. Singh's background and making the Toronto and Vancouver and other major city suburbs the battleground of choice, that's a whole lot harder to sell in Quebec.
Political science professor from the U of L, Dr. Geoffrey Hale, thanks again for joining me in studio.
My pleasure.